I am Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I was the architect of many of the arguments for women's rights.
Could you tell us a little bit about how your home life and your father influenced your beliefs about women's rights?
Certainly, and he was very instrumental in helping me formulate my opinions and perhaps become a rebel. I was born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York. It's a town about 40 miles northwest of Albany. My father was a lawyer. He had been a state representative. He was eventually a judge on the Supreme Court. My mother, Margaret Livingston, came from a very prominent American family. And her father actually had been in charge at West Point when Benedict Arnold pulled his treason and tried to turn over West Point to the English. He was instrumental in helping to capture Major Andre, the English spy. So my family was very involved in the Revolution. I had 5 sisters and 1 brother. That brother went off to college at age 20 and unfortunately came home and died. It was devastating to the family. It was especially devastating to my father, who quite obviously preferred boys and had great plans for what he was going to accomplish. I tried to comfort my father, and he looked at me and said, "Elizabeth, I wish you were a boy." It was obvious that boys were held in higher regard than girls. I resolved that I was going to be as good as my brother could have been. And I studied very hard at Johnstown Academy with the other children of the area. Many times I was doing better in Greek and Latin and mathematics than most of the boys. When I took a second in academics at that school, I ran to my father and I said, "Look, Father, what I have accomplished." And he basically said, "Elizabeth, I wish you were a boy." I was very mad, very sad, and again, it's probably started me on my path to be a rebel. His law office was attached to the house. I heard many of the grievances of the women who came in and were complaining about how they had been treated or even mistreated. And many times my father would have to advise them to stay in the marriage because the law, because they had no property, they would lose their children, they wouldn't have any money. I certainly didn't understand that. And when I questioned my father about the law, why was it that way? He said, "Elizabeth, go to Albany and change the law." So eventually I did. I did not understand how the Revolution, which was just a generation before me, and the laws could have left out 50% of the people, women. It seemed obvious to me that the laws were in favor of men, and even religious teachings provided an excuse for inequality. I learned at my father's office about the law and how to make arguments. I listened to my father. I argued with many of the students. Another major influence for me was my cousin, Garrett Smith. He was older than I was and very politically important in upstate New York. In fact, eventually he ran for president. He was an abolitionist, he was for temperance, and he had gatherings at his house and brought many original thinkers to that venue. And there I learned about liberty and inequality and personal freedom. I also met my husband there, Edward Stanton, and eventually we were married in 1840. For our honeymoon, we went to London. We were delegates to the World's conference on abolition. We got there as delegates, and they would not let the women be seated. They would not let them speak. They even shunted them off to another room. Those bigots, who we worked side by side with, would not give us the chance to speak. On the other hand, while I was there in London, I met Lucretia Mott and other women who had points of view about women's rights and the law and religion. We decided eventually when we returned to America, we were going to hold a conference and establish an organization for women's rights. Now, it took a while to accomplish that because for those next few years, I was helping my husband establish a law practice. I had children, and it was not until 1848 that we were able to hold the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, prior to that, I had worked in New York State, and I had lobbied for the Married Women's Property Rights Bill. And it was the first property rights bill that ensured married women would have and be able to hold property, keep their inheritances, and manage their own wages. And it was a standard that was spread throughout other states for married women property rights. Because when a woman marries, she loses her rights. When there were two people, all of a sudden there's one person, and your legal authority is gone. And that's what we were trying to change.
How is your declaration of sentiments and 18 grievances being received by the public?
I wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. It was based on the Declaration of Independence. It outlined the many grievances that women had, in that we were expected to follow laws that we never had voted on, and there were other authorities over us. We protested a government that existed without the consent of 50% of the people. We were forced to submit to laws to which we did not consent. We addressed property, employment and wages, inheritance, custody of children, economic health of the family, religious concerns, and I got in voting. And that was the probably most contentious item at that particular meeting, but we got it passed. Later on in life, we addressed divorce and birth control.
How were the grievances received by the public?
Well, I had no dread of prescribing what I thought was right and obvious, but the response surprised me. There were many articles, preachers preaching against what we had said, articles in the newspapers about what we had proposed and discussed. It spurred me on to really clarify my thinking and to write more and more and to speak more and more about the importance of women's rights and voting.
So during a period of time you chose to stay home with your 7 children, how did you contribute to the movement?
Well, fortunately, I had an absolutely wonderful housekeeper who helped to raise my children. I also very often took them with me as I went and spoke at various venues. But during that time, I very actively wrote and spoke for women's rights. There were conventions that were also held in other states, and we spoke there. I also spoke to the New York State Legislature and just further formulated the arguments for women's rights. In 1851, I was very fortunate because I met Susan B. Anthony, and we made a very good team. I would be able to write the arguments with her help She was a very good partner. And then she would go out and speak and travel to get the message out.
After the Civil War, when you were traveling more, what were some of your favorite speeches about? What were their subjects?
Well, after the Civil War, abolition had been accomplished. And so I turned more and more to women's rights issues and spoke at first fairly locally. But after about 1869, I traveled the nation and internationally speaking about the need for women's rights and suffrage. And suffrage became my major issue.
Why did you and Susan B. Anthony oppose the 14th and 15th Amendments giving black men the right to vote?
Basically, the women's organization that we had formed, the National Women's Suffrage Association, split. I was outraged that former slaves would get suffrage ahead of women. Other people felt that it was very important at that time, and I felt it was going to diminish activity on women's issues. And I was right. We didn't get it for 50 years later.
Now, how did other suffragists treat you? How did they react?
Oh, they scorned us. They scorned us for what our views were. But we kept very busy. During the 1870s, I traveled, and I spoke on women's rights all over. Even going out west, I was traveling 8 months a year. But during the 1880s, as I got older, I started to write, and we wrote the history of women's suffrage.
It took 6 years to write the history of women's suffrage. What was it like to work with the other women, and what was your biggest role?
There was a split in the organization. Lucy formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and their approach was to work to gain suffrage for the black population. I, in turn, continued to work for the women's rights and spoke extensively about legislation and lobbied heavily for the property rights, divorce rights, reproductive rights, educational rights, and in general, start to change people's opinion about those things. We proposed legislation in various states. We proposed legislation nationally for women's suffrage. And all of those were turned down. I even ran for office at one point. I got 24 votes out of thousands. It was the constant pressure and push to get our point known, to change people's views, to make possible what everyone years before had said was not possible. And in my lifetime, I believe I achieved a lot of that.